Welcome back. This is Get It Right with me, Susan Mwangi, and today we are discussing matters food security and food safety with Dr. Victor Yamo, who is the Farming Campaigns Manager at World Animal Protection here in Africa. So tell us more about food safety and what that is all about.
In a nutshell, again, food safety is about ensuring that the food that comes to your table is wholesome. And wholesome is just to say that the food has the correct nutrients. It will not have anything that will impact on your health negatively. And health here is at the widest context, not necessarily physical health, but also mental health and anything. That food should not be able to, should not do anything or have any negative impact on your health, essentially.
All right. Yeah. And what is this that makes food to be considered as unsafe?
Food can be unsafe due to various reasons. One is, and I want us to understand that just like food is good and nutritious for us, food is also good and nutritious for other organisms that might not be good for us. A classical example, food is known to transmit diseases, and commonly food which is contaminated with bacteria will give you a stomach upset. Depending on the bacterium, it can be severe to very acute and very causing severe illness. So that's part of it. So organisms like bacteria, rickettsia, and all these other things that cause disease-causing pathogens should not be on the food, and their levels at which they're not supposed to be, or if there's contamination, there's acceptable limit, and that's something that we look at. Food also should not have chemicals, and food ends up with chemicals because either we use those chemicals in the production of the food. A good example, we use certain sprays to manage pests, but that spray might that chemical that you're spraying might end up having certain residues on the food itself, and when you consume it, it will cause a chemical reaction and make you feel unwell. Food should also not have, in other situations, we also add products to keep the food quote-unquote fresh. And farmers, I think in this country, have then learned the art of adding certain products in certain foods, which is not acceptable within certain limits. That's the other thing. Occasionally, because of poor post-harvest losses or poor storage of the food itself, the food can then become contaminated by things like fungi. And that's where we end up with things like mycotoxins in the food. And then, depending on how we handle it, then that becomes part of the process. So there are various reasons, and looking at the whole value chain, the contamination can occur during production, it can occur during processing, it can occur on transportation, it can also occur at the point where the lady of the house or whoever is cooking, the cook, is preparing a meal. There can actually be contamination at that level.
Okay. Yeah. And what are some of the things that can cause the animal meat that we consume to be unsafe? From where you're seated now that you work with the World Animal Organization.
There's a whole, that's a whole interesting, Susan, that's very interesting. It's a question that we can take a whole day discussion. But I'll just cut it down to simple things that then the farmer can, the viewer can be able to understand. When you're doing production of animals, the first thing that you need to be very clear about is the feed that you put into that process. And feeds constitute 70% of cost of production in the production system. So it's a very big component, but it's also the place where the biggest contamination occurs. I'll give you a good example. If the maize that we are using, and again, you are a Kenyan like me, so you've had this. Occasionally when we have rotten maize in the silos, the most common thing is you hear people saying, feed it to the animal. Yeah? The reason why you are not supposed to do that is the animal is a concentrator of some of these things. So for instance, if the maize was rotten and you feed it to the animal, the first thing that happens is the animal's production is depressed because of the toxins that are in that maize. That's the first thing. The second thing, the animal then concentrates these toxins that are coming from that contaminated maize. And what does it do? It either puts it on meat or in eggs or in milk. And research done in this country has shown that that's the case. What then happens is that what you were avoiding by not eating that maize ends up on your table because the animal has concentrated it and sent it back to you. So that's one of the things that we need to be looking at. Look at, when I leave feeds and move into water, look at water. If water is contaminated, that same water, if you give it to the animal does the same thing, concentrates the bacteria on either milk, meat, or eggs, and sends it back to you. And that's why it's a rule of thumb for producers that if you cannot drink the water, don't put it into the production system.
So there is something you mentioned. The international market is very specific with the quality of the produce they take to their countries. Why don't we have the same, that anything can end up in our market? You know, recently we had the flour, which had toxic on our shelves. And it was good that it was discovered. Otherwise, so many of us would have consumed the same. You mentioned about milk adulteration. That is big. How can that really be fixed?
I think there are two levels of fixing that issue. One level is you and I as consumers. What are we asking? Yeah? Do I go to a supermarket and just buy meat because I want to buy meat, or do I interrogate the butcher and ask him where did the meat come from? Do we have, and essentially what I'm saying is, do we have a relationship with the retailer that is selling some of these products to us? Because that's the point, that's where we lose it. Because we just walk in, but whatever is on the shelf, pick and go. The question is, we need to start asking ourselves, and part of it is, I think, consumers are not even aware of what to ask for. So when some of these things come out that maize meal can have certain things, it shocks us. But it's simply because we are not taking time to understand the food that we are eating and the impact it can have on our health. So that's one. The second level is, we as consumers, are we holding the relevant government or agencies accountable? Yeah? Or is it the question of, ni sawa tu, serikali will do what it needs to do, as we will survive here? There is agencies that are required to do certain things. Kenya Bureau of Standards has standards. How frequently are those standards adhered to? We as consumers, are we even aware of those standards? So we just hear there's Kenya Bureau of Standards and that's it. When you see a KEBS mark of quality on a product, what does it tell you? If I'm going to buy a product like chicken, what should I be looking at on the packaging? Is it just the weight, 1.6, 1.8 or whatever, or the price, or is there certain things I need to look on the packaging? Things like a stamp showing that the Director of Veterinary Services has actually inspected the product, a stamp showing that it conforms to certain Bureau of Standards requirements. And when you see those stamps, do we understand what the implication behind it is? So that if something failed, if I went home and I found that the chicken wasn't what I expected, where is my recourse? Do I know how to then put that complaint into the system?
Okay. And for the products which may not carry the KEBS mark, how else can we be able to tell that it is safe, especially the animals products such as meat?
Well, that's what I said. One, each of those products has an agency that looks at it. There's no meat that is sold in this country that is not inspected. Yeah.
I'll do that in the evening.
Yeah.
What should I look out for me to know that this is safe?
One, I think for you as a consumer, one is to look at the butcher itself. Is it registered? It should have certain certifications under the Meat Control Act, under the Public Health Act, etc., etc. Please look and ensure that is there appropriately. Secondly, how are they handling? Look at the food handlers. Yeah? As a good Kenyan, you have a right to demand for a food handler certificate. If somebody is cutting meat and they're blowing their nose, there's a problem. Yeah? If somebody is cutting meat and the clothes they're wearing is not clean, there's a problem. Yeah? But you see, these things happen now consistently on our system. If you have the capacity, yeah, any meat that is being sold in this country is actually inspected and it has a roller mark. So that is something you can be looking at. You can be asking for a certificate of transportation. Those things are available. It's only that, and I say that part of our problem is we, the Kenyan population, are not aware of what to ask for. Yeah? And that is why we as an organization are big on raising consumer awareness so that consumers start asking the right question. Because the food that ends on your table depends on how the animal is treated at the various stages it goes through, and ultimately also depends on whether the regulations around that product is being looked at and adhered to.
Maybe before we close, you can tell us some of the mistakes that could be done, are done at household levels, people without the knowledge of really that it could cause poisoning.
One of the big mistakes that happens at household level is how you then prepare meat. Yeah? Meat should not be prepared, especially if you're going to do salads. You should have a different set of utensils for salads and a different set of utensils for meats, because the juice coming from that meat can contaminate your salad. Yeah, if the juice was having a problem and it was cooked properly, maybe you do not have a problem. But if you then the same knife that you're cutting meat and you're cutting mboga with, ultimately the transmission could go to the mboga and you end up with a totally different problem. There's also things like people thaw products and then refreeze them because you want just a small bit of it. You cut it, you thaw, and then you refreeze. That process is not correct because that ruins the quality of the product, but B also allows for, if it's contamination, for bacteria to grow, then be frozen. And so there's a whole lot of things that you need to look at. Separate cooking utensils, especially preparation utensils, how you thaw the meats, how you keep the meats. The meats should not be kept together with the fresh vegetables because of possibilities of contamination.
Give us a well-rounded parting shot.
My parting shot would be that it's time for consumers to start taking food safety seriously. And food safety is basically linked to a series of things. But for me, the big one is the way you treat the animal will ultimately have an impact on the quality of product that ends on your table. And so animal welfare becomes a big thing that we need to be looking at because a well-treated animal produces more products and better quality products, which then addresses our food safety issues and our food security issues. Thank you.
So thank you so much for making time for us. We will have you back on the show. There is still so much that we need to talk about.
Anytime.
Okay. So thank you so much for keeping it, Katie and Farmers TV. This brings us to our episode today on Get It Right. And as always, we love to hear from you. Give us your feedback through the number that is on your screen. Until next time, it's bye-bye from us.